There is a moment that often arrives without warning, usually long after the world has stopped asking you questions out loud, when you begin noticing how your own voice has grown quieter, not weaker, not uncertain, just quieter. It is the kind of quiet that surprises people who once knew you as someone driven by sharp conviction, relentless curiosity, or visible intensity. And maybe, if you are honest, you have felt this shift inside yourself too. The slow, almost unnoticeable transition from needing to be heard to needing to understand why you ever needed to be heard at all. Most people assume silence is the result of exhaustion or defeat. They see a man speak less and believe he has lost his fire. But what if silence is not the absence of strength? What if it is what strength becomes after it has survived its own noise? That question has followed me through many imagined nights of reflection, sitting in rooms filled with unfinished ideas and quiet machinery humming like distant thoughts. It is a question that does not rush toward answers. It waits patiently, like a shadow that lengthens as the day fades. I remember an early period in this fictional life where everything felt urgent. Ideas arrived quickly, emotions ran close to the surface, and every conversation felt like a stage where conviction needed to be proven. I believed that clarity required articulation, that respect required explanation, and that if you held a vision strong enough, it deserved to be spoken loudly enough for the world to adjust around it. There was a kind of purity in that belief, a youthful confidence that noise and passion were evidence of sincerity, but over time, something subtle began to change. Not because the visions faded, but because the reactions to them began teaching me something I had not anticipated. I started noticing how often people responded not to the substance of what I was saying, but to the intensity of how I was saying it. They reacted to the force before they could absorb the meaning. And that realization created an uncomfortable awareness. Sometimes strength, when expressed loudly, becomes difficult for others to approach honestly. There is a memory that lingers from those earlier years. An imagined conversation where I spoke for too long, trying to carry an idea across a bridge of language that could not support its weight yet. I watched someone listen politely, nod occasionally, and then respond with careful neutrality. Not rejection, not agreement, just distance disguised as understanding. That moment stayed with me far longer than any applause ever could. It planted a quiet question inside me. If people cannot truly hear you through your intensity, is your strength helping your truth or hiding it? I did not change overnight. Strength rarely softens that quickly. Instead, I began observing myself more carefully. I noticed how often I filled silence out of discomfort, how quickly I offered explanations before anyone even asked for them. There was a deeper fear beneath that habit, one I resisted acknowledging. The fear that if I stopped explaining myself, I might disappear from relevance, from influence, from emotional connection. It is a fear many strong individuals carry quietly. The belief that presence must be maintained through constant expression. Yet silence has a strange way of revealing truth. There were evenings when conversations ended, rooms emptied, and I sat alone with thoughts that no longer needed to compete with external reactions. In those moments, I noticed something unexpected. The ideas I cared about most did not feel fragile in silence. They felt clearer, more defined, almost as if they preferred stillness over performance. That discovery unsettled me at first, because it challenged a belief I had carried for years. The belief that strength must always be visible to remain real. I began noticing that the strongest parts of my identity were forming in private reflections, not public declarations. The patience to sit with uncertainty. The willingness to admit when timing was incomplete. The courage to allow others to misunderstand temporarily while something deeper matured internally. These qualities did not feel dramatic. They felt almost invisible. And yet, they carried a durability that loud conviction never quite achieved. You may have experienced a similar shift in your own life, perhaps in relationships where you once fought to explain your intentions, only to later discover that presence communicated more than words ever could. Or in professional moments where speaking less allowed your work to speak with a clarity language could not replicate. Silence, when chosen intentionally, begins transforming from absence into authority. Not authority over others, but authority over your own emotional rhythm. There was a long imagined night where I sat looking out at a horizon filled with lights from distant buildings, each one representing lives, stories, ambitions unfolding quietly. I found myself wondering how many of those lights belonged to people who once felt the need to be louder than they truly were, and how many of them eventually discovered that quiet confidence carries a different kind of gravity, the kind that does not pull attention toward itself, but allows attention to arrive naturally when substance exists beneath it. Still, the transition toward quiet strength is not peaceful at first. It carries internal conflict that most people never see. Because becoming quieter requires confronting a question that feels deeply personal. If you remove performance, who remains? If you stop explaining yourself, do you trust that your presence alone carries enough meaning? That question does not have immediate comfort. It lingers like a mirror that reflects more honestly than pride would prefer. I noticed during that transition how some people interpreted my quietness as detachment. Others mistook it for calculation. And occasionally I wondered if they were right. Silence can feel ambiguous to those who rely on constant reassurance. And I had to ask myself another difficult question. Was I becoming quiet out of wisdom or out of emotional withdrawal? The answer was not immediate, and perhaps it never fully is. But sitting with that uncertainty taught me something essential. True quiet strength does not isolate. It observes, listens, and chooses expression carefully. Not sparingly. There is a subtle difference between speaking less and feeling less. One creates clarity, the other creates distance. Learning to recognize that difference became one of the most delicate emotional skills I have ever tried to understand. Because strong men are often praised for endurance, but rarely encouraged to examine how endurance shapes their emotional availability. And as I continued exploring that shift, another question began forming beneath the surface of my reflections. What experiences teach a man that his loudest strength eventually becomes his quietest power? That question does not begin with success or recognition. It begins much earlier, in moments where expression feels necessary for survival itself, because before strength learns silence, it first learns to speak loudly enough to protect something deeply fragile inside. There is a memory that often returns when I think about how strength first learns to speak loudly. It appears like a distant echo, tied to a version of myself that believed intensity was not just expression, but protection. Protection from being overlooked, misunderstood, or quietly dismissed before ideas even had the chance to breathe. That memory connects to the question that lingered at the end of my last reflection. What experiences teach a man that his loudest strength eventually becomes his quietest power? The answer does not arrive in grand turning points. It forms in smaller, repeated moments where being heard feels inseparable from being valued. In those early imagined years, I felt an urgency that lived beneath everything I pursued. It was not simply ambition. It was the fear that if I did not push ideas forward with visible force, they would dissolve into the background noise of safer, more familiar thinking. There was a certain loneliness in that urgency, though I did not recognize it at first. When you are driven by something others cannot fully see, speaking loudly becomes less about confidence and more about translating internal clarity into external reality. I remember conversations where my words moved quickly, almost racing against the possibility of interruption or dismissal. Not because people around me were hostile, but because unfamiliar ideas often create hesitation in listeners. That hesitation can feel like rejection when you are emotionally invested in something still fragile. And fragility, when it exists inside ambition, tends to defend itself through intensity. I did not realize then that every time I raised my voice emotionally, I was trying to protect something that had not yet learned how to stand on its own. There was one imagined discussion that has stayed with me longer than I expected. I was describing a vision that felt alive inside my mind, explaining each detail with relentless precision, convinced that clarity required persistence. The person listening remained patient, attentive, even respectful. But when I finally paused, They responded with a simple question I had not prepared for. They asked whether I believed in the idea, or whether I needed them to believe in it first. That question settled into me like a quiet weight, because it revealed a truth I had been avoiding. Sometimes loudness is not about expressing conviction. Sometimes it is about borrowing confidence from external validation. That realization did not soften me immediately. In fact, it created resistance. Strength often resists introspection when it threatens identity. I wanted to believe my intensity came purely from passion. But the more I observed myself, the more I noticed how external reactions subtly influenced my internal stability. When people responded with enthusiasm, I felt unstoppable. When they responded with neutrality, doubt crept in quietly, reshaping my tone, my energy, even my sense of direction. There is a fragile stage in every person's growth, where confidence depends heavily on reflection from others. It is not weakness. It is a natural beginning. But remaining in that stage for too long creates a cycle where expression becomes performance, and performance slowly disconnects from authenticity. I began noticing that the louder I became, the less I actually listened. Not only to others, but to the quieter parts of my own intuition that spoke in slower, more careful language. I remember an imagined evening when I reviewed conversations from earlier that day. Not the words themselves, but the emotional rhythm behind them. I noticed how often I spoke before allowing silence to reveal whether speaking was necessary. And that observation created discomfort I could not ignore, because it suggested that my strength was becoming reactive instead of intentional. That realization planted the first seeds of quietness, though I did not recognize them as growth at the time. They felt more like uncertainty, that there is a particular discomfort in discovering that something which once protected you may now be limiting you. Loud strength had helped me push through doubt, resistance, and early invisibility. It had created momentum when stillness might have been mistaken for hesitation. But momentum, when sustained too long, can drown out reflection. And reflection is where direction becomes refined. Instead of merely accelerated, you may have experienced moments where defending your perspective felt essential, only to later wonder whether being understood required less explanation and more patience. That shift is emotionally complex, because silence, especially after years of intensity, can feel like vulnerability without armor. It exposes uncertainty that loud conviction once concealed. And learning to sit inside that exposure requires a different form of courage, one that is less visible but far more demanding internally. I began noticing that when I allowed conversations to include silence, something unexpected happened. People spoke more honestly. They revealed concerns, insights, and emotional reactions that they might have withheld if I had filled every pause with explanation. That discovery unsettled me in a beautiful way. It showed me that strength expressed through listening creates space for truth that speaking alone cannot invite. Yet the transition toward quiet strength was not smooth. There were moments when I feared that reducing my intensity would reduce my influence. That fear is deeply rooted in many strong personalities. The belief that presence must be reinforced through constant articulation. And during those moments, I found myself caught between two instincts. The instinct to express and the instinct to observe. Both felt necessary. Both felt incomplete without balance. There was one long imagined night where I sat alone, surrounded by unfinished sketches of ideas and the faint mechanical sounds that often accompany creation. I asked myself a question that felt uncomfortably honest. If no one ever misunderstood me again, would I still feel the need to speak with such force? That question revealed how much of my loudness was shaped by anticipation of resistance rather than the natural rhythm of expression. The answer did not arrive immediately. Instead, it lingered, slowly reshaping how I approached both ambition and connection. I began understanding that quiet strength is not the absence of voice. It is the refinement of voice. It is the decision to speak when meaning requires it, and remain silent when presence communicates more deeply than language. Still, as I leaned into that understanding, another layer of uncertainty emerged. I began noticing how becoming quieter changed not only how others responded to me, but how I experienced myself. There were moments of unexpected calm, but also moments of unfamiliar loneliness. Because when you stop performing strength outwardly, you begin confronting what strength feels like inwardly, without distraction, and that confrontation raised another question that I could not yet answer. What happens when a man discovers that his loudest battles were never with the world, but with parts of himself he had not yet learned how to sit beside quietly? That realization would lead me into reflections far more personal than ambition or expression. It would lead me into the fragile territory where strength and vulnerability stop competing, and begin learning how to exist together. There is a particular kind of quiet that arrives after you begin realizing your loudest battles were never with the world, but with parts of yourself that felt too fragile to acknowledge openly. That quiet does not feel peaceful at first. It feels exposed, like standing in a room where every familiar distraction has been gently removed. I remember an imagined season of reflection where the noise of ambition continued around me, yet internally I could hear questions forming that were impossible to silence. And one question returned more often than I expected. If strength is no longer defined by resistance, then what is it meant to protect? In earlier years, I believed strength existed to defend vision from criticism and protect momentum from hesitation. But as my voice grew quieter, I began noticing that the most exhausting battles were not external disagreements. They were internal contradictions. The conflict between the version of myself that wanted to appear unshakable and the version that quietly longed to feel understood without needing to prove anything first. That contradiction created a tension I could not resolve through effort alone. There was a moment during one imagined late evening when I recognized how carefully I had built an identity around capability. Capability felt safe. It created admiration, respect, and predictability. But beneath that identity lived emotional questions that capability could not answer. Questions about belonging, about whether being admired feels different from being known, about whether strength sometimes becomes a shield that unintentionally blocks deeper connection. I resisted those questions at first because they felt like distractions from progress. Yet they returned, persistent and patient, asking to be acknowledged rather than solved. You may have experienced a similar realization in your own life. The moment when achievement no longer distracts you from wondering whether people see the effort behind your composure. The moment when you recognize how often strong individuals are appreciated for what they accomplish, but rarely invited to reveal what they carry internally. That awareness creates a loneliness that is difficult to explain, because it exists alongside success rather than in the absence of it. I began reflecting on how often I associated vulnerability with instability. I believed that revealing uncertainty would weaken authority, diminish clarity, or create unnecessary emotional complexity. But as silence became more comfortable, I noticed something unexpected. Vulnerability, when offered with calm intention, did not create instability. It created authenticity. And authenticity attracted a different kind of connection, one built on mutual recognition. Rather than admiration alone, there was an imagined conversation with someone who observed my quietness and asked whether I was becoming more cautious or simply more selective with my energy. That question stayed with me longer than I admitted, because it revealed a distinction I had not fully considered. Caution often grows from fear of loss. Selectiveness grows from clarity about what deserves emotional investment. I realized that my quietness was not about avoiding risk. It was about protecting emotional sincerity from being diluted by constant performance. Still, stepping into vulnerability created its own internal conflict. There were moments when I feared that showing emotional depth would invite expectations I could not always fulfill. Strength carries a certain simplicity. People trust consistency. Vulnerability introduces complexity. It reveals that even strong individuals experience doubt, fatigue, and moments where clarity feels distant. Learning to hold both strength and vulnerability, without allowing either to cancel the other, became one of the most delicate emotional balances I had ever encountered. I remember an imagined morning where I allowed myself to sit with memories of times when I chose strength over honesty in relationships. Not because I wanted to deceive, but because I believed composure would protect stability. And as those memories surfaced, I noticed how often silence had been used as armor instead of presence. That realization carried a quiet regret, not dramatic or overwhelming, but honest enough to reshape how I understood emotional availability. There is a difference between silence that protects truth and silence that hides it. Learning to recognize that difference requires patience and humility, because sometimes silence feels easier than articulation, especially when emotions feel complex or incomplete. Yet mature strength does not avoid complexity. It learns how to sit beside it without rushing toward resolution. That lesson changed how I approached connection, how I listened, and how I responded when others revealed their own uncertainty. You may have noticed that the strongest people you know often become the most careful with their words over time. Not because they have less to say, but because they understand how language shapes emotional atmosphere. Words can comfort, clarify, or unintentionally create distance. And as I became more aware of that responsibility, I found myself valuing intentional expression more than spontaneous intensity. Quiet strength began feeling less like restraint and more like respect. Respect for timing, for emotional readiness, for the unseen layers within every conversation. There was a long imagined night where I asked myself another question that felt deeply personal. If someone truly sees your vulnerability, does that strengthen your identity or make it dependent on their acceptance? That question lingered because it touched something fragile. The desire to be known carries risk. And risk, when connected to emotional truth, can feel more dangerous than professional failure. But avoiding that risk creates a life where strength becomes isolation disguised as independence. I began noticing that when vulnerability was shared with sincerity instead of expectation, it created space rather than pressure. It allowed connection to deepen naturally instead of through forced transparency. That discovery reshaped my understanding of quietness. Quietness was no longer about reducing expression. It became about refining it into something genuine enough to hold both certainty and doubt without conflict. Still, as I grew more comfortable with this balance, another layer of reflection surfaced quietly beneath my awareness. I began wondering whether strength and vulnerability alone could sustain a meaningful life, or whether there was another dimension waiting to be understood. A dimension connected to how time reshapes identity, how experience softens intensity into wisdom, and how strong men eventually learn that quietness is not only about internal clarity, but about how they choose to love, lead, and remain present as everything around them continues to change. There is a quiet transformation that begins when a man realizes strength and vulnerability are not destinations, but evolving states shaped by time itself. It is not a sudden revelation. It feels more like watching seasons change through a familiar window, noticing how the same landscape carries different meanings as light shifts across it. I remember an imagined period when this realization began forming slowly inside me, connected to the unresolved thought that lingered from earlier reflections. How does time reshape intensity into wisdom without erasing the fire that created it in the first place? In earlier years, time felt like something to outrun. Every idea demanded acceleration. Every opportunity felt temporary, fragile, as if hesitation might cause it to disappear forever. There was an urgency that lived in my decisions, one that created momentum but rarely allowed reflection to complete its natural rhythm. And momentum can feel powerful, almost addictive. It gives the illusion that movement itself equals progress. But over time, I began noticing that constant movement can blur emotional awareness. When everything moves quickly, you rarely notice what quietly changes inside you. There was a moment during an imagined late evening when I realized I could no longer measure growth through expansion alone. Expansion reveals how far you can go. But wisdom reveals why you choose certain directions and not others. That distinction began shifting how I understood strength. Strength was no longer simply endurance or capability. It became discernment. The ability to pause without losing confidence, to observe without feeling passive, to trust that timing carries intelligence. That effort alone cannot replicate. You may have experienced moments where slowing down felt uncomfortable, almost unnatural, especially after years of defining yourself through productivity or responsibility. Slowing down can feel like losing identity when identity has been built through action. I felt that discomfort deeply. There were imagined days when I questioned whether reflection would weaken my edge, whether stillness would soften the determination that once fueled every decision. But something unexpected began revealing itself through those quieter moments. Stillness did not weaken determination. It refined it. It filtered ambition through clarity, removing impulses that came from pressure rather than purpose. And I began noticing how many of my earlier decisions were influenced by invisible expectations. Expectations from society, from admiration, from internal narratives about what strength should look like. As those expectations became visible, they lost some of their authority. And in their absence, a calmer, more deliberate form of strength began emerging. There is a memory that returns often when I think about this shift. An imagined conversation with someone who asked me whether I ever worried that becoming quieter might make others believe I had lost ambition. It was an honest question, and it lingered longer than I expected, because it revealed how deeply we associate visible intensity with relevance. I found myself reflecting on whether ambition truly needs constant display, or whether it grows more resilient when it is allowed to mature privately. Over time, I realized that ambition, when untouched by constant validation, becomes more honest. It stops performing for approval and begins serving meaning. That transformation is subtle, almost invisible to observers. But internally, it creates a steadiness that loud determination rarely sustains. And within that steadiness, another realization surfaced. Quiet strength changes how a man loves. Love, in earlier years, often mirrored ambition. It was passionate, expressive, eager to reassure, eager to be understood. There is beauty in that stage. But time introduces complexity into love that intensity alone cannot navigate. Mature love begins asking different questions. Not how deeply you can feel, but how consistently you can remain present. Not how passionately you can promise, but how patiently you can listen when promises feel insufficient. I remember noticing how quiet strength began shaping my emotional availability. I became less focused on explaining intentions and more focused on demonstrating reliability through small, consistent gestures. There is a powerful intimacy and presence that does not rely on dramatic declarations. It lives in moments where attention is offered without distraction, where listening becomes a form of emotional protection, where silence communicates understanding. More gently than reassurance ever could. You may have felt the difference between someone who tries to solve your emotions and someone who simply sits beside them with you. Quiet strength learns that love is rarely about fixing uncertainty. It is about creating safety where uncertainty can exist without fear. And learning to create that safety requires patience that ambition alone cannot teach. It requires accepting that some emotional questions remain unanswered, yet still deserve to be held with care. There were imagined nights when I wondered whether becoming quieter meant becoming emotionally distant. That fear appears often during transformation, but I began noticing that distance is not created by silence. It is created by disengagement. Silence, when rooted in attentiveness, becomes a form of closeness that words sometimes interrupt. And that understanding reshaped how I balanced independence with connection. Still, another layer of reflection quietly formed beneath these realizations. I began wondering how strong men learn to carry the weight of time itself. Time changes relationships, priorities, identities, and dreams. And with each change, strength must evolve again. The loud confidence of youth rarely survives unchanged through decades of experience. It softens, deepens, sometimes breaks, and occasionally rebuilds itself in forms that feel unfamiliar but profoundly honest. There is a quiet humility in accepting that strength is not permanent. It is adaptive. And the men who eventually become quiet are not those who lose their power. They are those who understand that power must learn gentleness to remain human. That realization carries peace, but also responsibility. Because quiet strength influences others in ways louder strength never could. It shapes emotional atmospheres, creates safety through presence, and teaches without instruction simply by existing consistently. And as these reflections continued unfolding, one final question began rising slowly through my thoughts, one that felt both personal and universal. When a man reaches the stage where his strength becomes quiet, what remains at the center of his identity when ambition, vulnerability, time, and love have all reshaped him repeatedly? That question does not seek achievement or recognition. It seeks something far more permanent, the understanding of what it truly means to live in alignment with oneself when every external reason to prove strength begins to fade into quiet acceptance. There is a final stage in the quiet transformation of strength, one that feels less like revelation and more like gentle understanding. It arrives when the urgency to prove, to persuade, and to be acknowledged finally softens into a steady rhythm of presence. I imagine evenings where the world's noise fades, leaving only the subtle echo of what truly matters. And in those moments, I notice that quiet strength is no longer about defending ambition, or performing capability, or explaining every decision. It is about fidelity to oneself, remaining aligned internally, even when the world no longer watches. In earlier imagined years, I believe that impact required visibility. That the measure of a man's influence rested in the volume of his voice, the speed of his movement, the clarity with which he could convince others. But time, reflection, and repeated confrontation with doubt taught me something quietly profound. Influence does not always arrive through projection. Sometimes it arrives through patience, consistency, and the subtle reassurance that presence itself communicates more clearly than words ever could. I recall an imagined night where I observed patterns in those around me. The people who carried themselves quietly, those who spoke selectively, who listened more than they answered. They carried a gravitational pull that intensity often missed. There is a calm authority in restraint, a weight in reflection, and an undeniable clarity in listening. Their quietness is not absence, is refinement. And in that refinement, I began noticing the echo of my own evolution. The loud man of earlier years had not disappeared. He had simply learned that quiet carries its own strength. This quietness also reshapes relationships. Love, connection, and loyalty respond differently to subtlety than to spectacle. I imagine conversations where presence mattered more than explanation, where gestures mattered more than declarations, and where consistency mattered more than intensity. In those moments, I noticed that quiet strength does not distance others. It invites them in, without pressure, without performance. And I understood that the most profound influence a strong man can have is not measured in outcomes or admiration, but in the safe spaces he cultivates for others to show their own strength without fear. Even internal conflict begins to transform. The questions that once haunted me about doubt, identity, and authenticity shift from urgent dilemmas to contemplative companions. I ask them less to find immediate answers and more to observe the way they shape me. The quiet rule I follow when people doubt me is no longer a shield. It is a framework for presence. It teaches patience. It shows that enduring strength does not always assert itself. Sometimes it simply waits, listens, and allows clarity to form naturally. There are nights when reflection deepens further, revealing the subtleties of legacy. I imagine walking through memories of conversations, decisions, and unspoken moments. I realize that what remains is rarely the magnitude of ambition, the scope of achievement, or even the visibility of success. What remains is emotional resonance, the imprint left through presence, honesty, and the deliberate care with which strength is exercised. And I sense that quiet men eventually become quiet not because the world diminishes them, but because their influence has evolved beyond demonstration. It becomes invisible yet undeniable. I thought often about the younger version of myself, the one who equated speaking loudly with being heard. I feel a quiet compassion for that self, understanding now that intensity was necessary then, but I also see the transformation as inevitable. Strength matures when it learns to differentiate between urgency and importance, between action and reflection, between being seen and being understood. That evolution carries humility, not defeat, presence, not performance. And it teaches the rare skill of living with integrity without constantly validating oneself externally. Love and connection deepen. Alongside this quiet strength, I imagine relationships where mutual trust grows not from verbal insistence, but from reliability of presence, small gestures repeated without expectation, and a shared patience for the unfolding of emotional truth. Quiet strength allows for vulnerability without fear of exploitation. It balances patience and attentiveness, showing that caring deeply does not require constant verbal reassurance. This balance is subtle, often invisible to observers, but transformative to those who experience it directly. And finally, I reach the reflection that has guided these imagined evenings. The quiet man is not silent because he has nothing to say, but because he has learned that sound is most meaningful when it serves understanding, not ego. Silence is not emptiness, it is a vessel for clarity. Listening becomes more than a habit. It becomes a principle. And in that principle, strength reaches a form of maturity that is enduring, grounded, and humane. It allows ambition to coexist with presence, courage to coexist with patience, and love to coexist with independence. In this quiet state, questions remain, but they no longer demand answers. They are observed with patience, respected for their complexity, and allowed to shape perspective without destabilizing it. And I understand that this is the ultimate evolution of strength. It becomes quiet not because it has weakened, but because it has matured. The man who speaks less, listens more, and prioritizes presence over performance is the man who has finally learned that true power is not measured externally, but internally by the constancy of alignment, the patience of observation, and the generosity of presence.